Welcome to the Talking Sports Law Podcast, created and produced by K&L Gates. Each episode features a discussion of legal issues from the world of sports, interviews with sports law professionals, and analysis of recent trends. Let's get this episode kicked off.
Welcome to another episode of Talking Sports Law from K&L Gates. I am your host, John Wilson. I'm here with my co-host, Trevor Gates. Trevor, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, John. How are you?
I'm doing great. It's great to be back on the podcast. You know, it's like Michael Jordan returning to the Bulls in 1995. It's like Mike Tyson coming out of retirement to fight on Netflix. We are back. We took a long break, but here we are. Good to be back putting out another episode of Talking Sports Law. And we're very excited on today's podcast to be joined by Bob Caldwell. Bob is the Vice President and General Counsel for Real Salt Lake of Major League Soccer and their affiliated clubs, including Utah Royals of NWSL, Utah Monarchs of MLS Next Pro, RSL Academy, and all of their facilities, including America First Field located in beautiful Salt Lake City. We'll get into Bob's background in the interview, but he has extensive experience in the world of sports with various teams, various leagues, and we're just thrilled to have him as a guest on Talking Sports Law. Bob is a graduate of Miami University, go Red Hawks, and he attended law school at the University of Alabama, Roll Tide. Bob has also received an advanced certification in football law, football as they call it in the EU and other places throughout the world, or soccer law, from the UEFA Academy, and he has an executive master's degree in global sports governance from the University of London. Bob Caldwell, welcome to Talking Sports Law, and thanks so much for joining us.
John, thank you for having me. It's good to be with you and Trevor, who are not only my interviewers, but also my lawyers. It's great to always be with you guys.
And don't worry, Bob, we will not be violating the attorney-client privilege on any of our podcast questions today. But let's start off with just a little bit of a background, Bob. What was the path you took to your current role, and how did you become interested in sports law?
Yeah, so my path was a little bit non-traditional compared to a lot of my peers. In terms of how I got interested in sports law, it was very early on in my legal career when my best friend, who was an NFL place kicker, needed some help on a legal matter. And it just so happened that I had relocated recently to Las Vegas, and the contract that he needed to dispute had a Nevada choice of law clause in it, and a Nevada forum selection clause. So was able to help him. We had a really good result on that one. And over time, he and other people in my circle were able to refer more and more sports law matters, and just always seemed like one of the most fun parts of my practice that I wanted to expand. But as far as where I went along the way, as I said, I took a little bit of a non-traditional path. A lot of my peers are mergers and acquisitions attorneys who worked on a deal for a new ownership group to buy into a club and stayed on post-transaction. A lot of others came in as interns when they were in law school and stuck around. So for me, I ended up being in a more traditional law firm role for a little bit more than 20 years, specializing my practice in business law and business litigation. And over time, the sports just became more and more of a bigger piece of that pie. And at some point, being in Las Vegas, they didn't have any professional first division teams for a long time. And I started working more and more in some of the combat sports, representing some of the big names in boxing and mixed martial arts. Ultimately represented guys like Conor McGregor and Khabib Nurmagomedov. And when Khabib retired, he and his manager called me and said they wanted to compete with UFC and start a new league, and asked me if I would be interested in relocating to Miami to help them build a new professional MMA league. And that sounded a lot more interesting than working in a law firm.
Yeah, it sounds like it, Bob. Thank you. Can you provide us an overview of your role with the RSL and the Royals and sort of what a, quote, typical day looks like for you?
What I love about it is that there are no typical days. There's a really wide variety of things that we work on here. And much like working in that MMA company, which was called Eagle FC, you never just knew for sure what was going to happen. And I think one of the things I really like is that some days I'm a lawyer and some days I'm a business executive. And some days I'm a soccer executive, and that provides a good deal of variety. But as far as a typical day, there's a couple tasks that we really get involved with in a regular basis. Probably the biggest one of those is handling sponsorship agreements. One of the biggest differences I think we've seen in the evolution of in-house professional sports practice is just the number of and the size of sponsorship deals that we're being involved in. And so I usually will get involved in a deal relatively early when my business folks are starting to negotiate it so that we can make sure that we have it on track for what it's going to look like on paper once they get through court terms. And then we'll negotiate usually with the sponsors counsel some of the finer points of the agreement. And hopefully then we get to see that sponsor's brand in our stadium or on our jerseys one of these days. So that's a big part of what we do. And then for us, I'm more involved probably on the sports side than some of my peers are. MLS and NWSL employ all of the first team players. It's kind of a unique aspect of the two single entity soccer leagues, but we have the second team called Real Monarchs. Those players are our employees. All of our coaching staff and our folks that are not players, they're our employees also. So we do a lot of employment agreements. And then I get involved with some of our more complicated transfers to look at training compensation, solidarity, some of those things that are unique to the FIFA system, to be able to help out our sporting director and his staff to put the best team possible on the pitch so that we can have a successful season.
Bob, now I have not done an exhaustive survey of all of your peers throughout Major League Soccer and NWSL, but I would venture to guess that you are probably the only general counsel who has a background in mixed martial arts. So that is a bit unique. How would you compare the differences from working in the world of combat sports, MMA, and where you are now working in soccer?
Well, I guess you can take an elbow to the face in both sports, but aside from that, the biggest differences for me might not have been the sports themselves, but the state in which I joined those organizations. So with Eagle FC, I was employee number 3. We had one person that was heading the sports side, one person that was heading the media side, and I was the next one in. And so being able to build a league from scratch was really fascinating to me. Some of it is exactly what you would expect. We had to build a relationship with the Florida Athletic Commission, so our fights were regulated, helping my boss to determine matchups and do fighter contracts and things of that nature. But then also some of the non-traditional things were being involved in the branding for the entity. So what was our consumer name going to be? What were our logos going to look like? All the way to the point where I was working on our ticketing system and the seating chart for our arena and things of that nature. So I would say that with MMA, the other big difference is that you directly employ all of your athletes, and making sure that you have flexibility in a contract in MMA. You have a lot more latitude to structure that contract than we do in one of the big 5 sports in North America, where you're kind of beholden to the key terms of a collective bargaining agreement and what that master standard player agreement looks like. So just to give you an example on how that looks, this is the nerdy side of being a lawyer within the sports side of things. In MMA, we wanted to make sure that if a fighter was on a bad string of performance, that we had options to terminate the contract. And so if we didn't like the way their fighting style was and they had a kind of a boring fight, if they were on a string of losses, we would want to terminate that agreement a little bit earlier. To the contrary, if somebody was a champion, we'd want clauses in that agreement that extended their contract so that we didn't have a champion that very quickly moved off into a different promotion. So there was a lot more flexibility in terms of what you were able to do with your athletes. In MLS, there's a really strong players union, both in the MLS and the NWSL side of things. And our contracts with those players are pretty much fill in the blank, and there's not a lot of blanks that you can change. So in terms of how that all interplays, I think you just have a lot more day-to-day interaction with players and their agents on the MMA side, and maybe a little bit more on the business side of things with soccer.
Bob, what are some of the more complex issues you face in your current role?
I'm really blessed to work with and work for some really amazing ownership. David Blitzer is our primary owner, and I work together with one of his very close colleagues, who's another one of our owners, named Scott Craze. And David and Scott, you could not find two better people to work with. And so I kind of start by answering that question, that they made one thing really easy for me. And that is that on the first day we ever had a complex issue, they said something very fundamental, but something that I never take for granted. They said, always do the right thing. Always do the right thing by our employees and our players. Always tell the truth. Do the right thing in the community. If we make a mistake, we raise our hand and say we made a mistake, and we go about fixing it. And as long as you follow that golden rule, you'll never have a problem with us. And so that makes handling the complex issues a lot easier for me, because you kind of have that true north guidepost to keep your compass pointed in the right direction. So as far as the complex issues, I think there's a couple of them that come up from time to time. There could be an issue with compliance on an MLS rule. There could be an employment law matter, whatever those may be. Those are always things where you want to make sure that you keep the circle tight, make sure that you have a good sense of the issues that may be at play. And, you just kind of have to some degree internalize a lot of those decisions before you can open up that circle to a broader group of decision makers. And that can be a little bit tricky. The other complex issues, I would say, at times are dealing with the unions. Each of the unions have their own personalities, and they're zealous advocates. And there's a lot of times we can work really closely hand in hand. But, there's times where they will stand up as they should for their players, and dealing with some of those issues, you want to be sensitive to what their needs are and why they're advocating a particular point. And the only thing I can say in terms of how to handle those types of issues is interpersonal communication is key. Instead of shooting each other back emails and texts, pick up the phone, get on a call and talk to somebody. I find that whether it's a sponsorship agreement or an issue with the players union, finding out why something is important to someone else is key. And once you know what their needs and wants are, and they have a sense of what yours are, you can usually find a solution. So regardless of what the complex issues are, I think communication is pretty key in solving them.
We mentioned this kind of in the intro, but I know that you just completed a very comprehensive program that was offered by UEFA Academy. And as a result of that, you received this executive master's in global sports governance. I remember that you were, traveling all over the world to attend these courses, and it was a very robust, comprehensive curriculum. But can you just share a little bit about that experience and, how it's kind of benefited you in your current role?
Yeah, UEFA is the governing body for soccer in Europe. And because Europe's kind of the epicenter of soccer, it's really advanced in terms of the types of resources it provides to its members. The UEFA Academy is a really, really good organization. They handled my football law program when I did that a while back. And they are also key in putting on this MESCO program. It's called, I think it's a French acronym for Executive Masters in Global Sports Governance. But it was a 9-week program. Spread out over almost 2.5 years. So basically 1 week every quarter for those 2.5 years. Every week is in a different city around the world. And every day within that week is in a different sports venue. So give you an example, the first week we were in Switzerland. Day 1 was at UEFA. Day 2 was at the International Olympic Committee, where we met with Thomas Bach and the executives who put on the Olympic Games. The third day we went to the UCI, which is the International Cycling Federation, and talked about investigations into Lance Armstrong and different cheating scandals over the years, and how they are very careful in terms of how they write and enforce rules and regulations within the sport. One day we went to the Volleyball Association and talked about how venture capital is investing in their sport and how that's kind of changed the sport a bit. And then the last day we were at FIBA, which is the International Basketball Federation. And there we had a case study on a particular governance issue, broke up in groups and had to solve it for them. And the cool thing was it was a problem that had already happened. And so after we presented our solutions, they talked to us about how they solved it, what they wish they would have done, and how different things that they had tried actually played out. And it was just fascinating. So that's an example of a typical week. Every week, though, had a different theme. And in addition to all the things you learn, which I take with me to my job every single day, the other important thing is who you learn them with. And so with our class, I couldn't have asked for better classmates. We had the head of player status and transfers for FIFA. We had the executive directors of some of the biggest soccer associations in world football. And in this particular one, it wasn't just soccer. It was also, we had the vice president for NBA Africa and people that had different sports backgrounds. And so just to kind of learn from all of these experts and talk about the issues that are really facing sports organizations today, it gives you a lot of ideas on things you might want to implement when you go back home to your own organization.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of great experiences and nice travel and great classmates. What are some of the trends or sort of big issues you see in sports law in the coming year, whether that's related to any of the issues, the more complex issues you mentioned previously, or something else?
Yeah, I tend to stay away from collegiate athletics in terms of these discussions because that is changing every single day. But when we look at professional sports law, there are some things that we see happening. In my sport in particular, you have a couple big issues. We're getting ready for the 2026 FIFA World Cup to be held in the United States. And so for us, it's really a big focus on how do we capitalize on this, I would say once in a lifetime, but for me, it's the twice in a lifetime opportunity to host the biggest sporting event in the world. And so we're working with FIFA to potentially be a venue for one of the national teams as their training facility during the tournament. And we're also looking with all of our sponsors in terms of how do we capitalize on a summer when the eyes of the world and certainly the eyes of the U.S. more than ever before will be on our sport. So I think those are big issues for my particular sport in terms of making sure we're best positioned to capitalize on the popularity of that event. Overall, I think all sports want to have peace with their labor unions. That's not unique to soccer or basketball or any others. So I do see that, finding the right balance between working with ownership groups and working with players unions is something that all of the leagues are still kind of trying to get a handle around. So I do think you'll see some issues there with continued efforts to work collaboratively with between leagues and unions to find long-term resolution on a number of different governance issues to make sure that each sport is viable for a long period of time.
Bob, besides my parents and Trevor's parents, one of our biggest segments of our audience are law students, and specifically law students who are interested in potentially getting into sports law. And so as kind of a nod to all of the law students who might be listening to this, I was wondering, what was a class that you maybe wish that you would have taken when you were in law school to sort of prepare you for your current role?
Yeah, I mean, I took a number of classes in contract law, and some of those were the main requirements. If I had time to go back, I would probably take more classes in different contract disciplines, maybe something specifically on mergers and acquisitions. When I got into practice, a big part of my particular practice was litigation. And so the biggest learning curve for me when I went in-house was really focusing on where transactional law was the number one thing I needed to be sharp on. And, part of that is you learn by doing. Part of it is you affiliate yourself with experts. That's part of the reason why we hired John and Trevor. But if I were to go back, I'd probably take some additional classes in the M&A space. That said, I mean, if I'm going to give advice to a law school student, I would also say that you may know that you want to be a transactional lawyer, but you can't just go down that route. I think it's really important for anyone to have some background in litigation. Litigation has turned into a useful skill for me in the last 2 years, more than I ever would have imagined. And sometimes it's not because you're involved in a lawsuit, but just kind of the the analysis, the thinking steps ahead, the strategy that you really need to employ in a litigation context is something that would be indispensable. So I would say for even someone who just knows what they want to do and they want to, work on the transactional side of things, you're going to miss out if you don't have some balance in your practice areas. And so specialize, sure, but don't over specialize. The best thing you can do is be well-rounded.
And there's our whistle, which signifies the end of our regular time, which means we are going to be heading into extra time. So Bob, during our extra time segment, Trevor and I will be firing some questions at you, and they have nothing to do probably with what you currently do for RSL and the Royals, but would love your just initial reaction to those. So Bob, are you ready for extra time?
As long as it's not golden goal, let's go.
No golden goal. No golden goal. All right, here we go. Bob, what is your favorite activity or hobby when you aren't working?
Yeah, I don't know when I'm not working these days. So I would say that my favorite hobby is probably travel, and particularly travel in relation to sporting events. These days, I love when I'm able to hop on one of our team charters to go watch my team play in another city, and to catch up there with people that are in my network and be able to share that with them. So I would probably say a combination of travel and sports.
What is the greatest live sports moment you've ever been a part of?
Yeah, it's a tougher one. There's a couple candidates. I was at the final of one of the European Championships for soccer in France. That was pretty special. I've been to almost all of the World Cups in the last 25 or so years. Those are each very unique. Being in Brazil for the World Cup with a number of professional players and being able to kick around a ball on the beach was special. But for me, I'm going to go with a sport that I don't work in, but it would have been Game 5 of the 2023 Stanley Cup Finals. I've been a Vegas Golden Knights season ticket holder since day one, advised the team prior to it being launched. And to watch our captain hoist the Stanley Cup after a 9-3 win, that was just really a special moment. It wasn't the most nail-biter of a game at 9-3. I think we knew about halfway through that day that we were going to be Stanley Cup champions. And so the atmosphere in that arena was much of a party atmosphere for the last hour. And I will never forget having been there in person.
Yeah, that sounds like an amazing moment. Bob, what is one book or TV show or podcast that you've really enjoyed in the last 6 months or so?
Yeah, so I have to admit, I'm not a big reader. I watch a lot of documentaries, but when I joined Real Salt Lake, our president has an executive meeting every week, and we have a book club. And the first book that we read was called The Captain's Class. And I really enjoyed that. It looked at what really set apart the best leaders in sports. So the leaders of the dynasty teams, not just one that had a good year here and there, but who were the leaders that had really sustained success for their teams? You think about the great teams at UCLA or really dominant sports programs, and what were the characteristics of those leaders, and trying to translate that into what I'm doing now and how we lead people as business executives, for me, was just a really interesting way to take a leadership book, mix it with the sports industry, and kind of be very relevant to what I'm doing in my life at this point.
You mentioned traveling, but Bob, if you were not working as a sports lawyer and in your current role, what do you think you'd be doing?
I'd love to say it would be being a professional soccer player, but I wasn't good enough. I made it to the pros as a lawyer, not as a player. But no, I really enjoyed some of the things I did when I was working at Eagle FC, and so I would say if I wasn't a sports lawyer, I'd still want to be involved in sports as a business executive, whether that was in a sponsorship role or an operations role. Something just feels right about when I come to work every day these days. It feels like I'm in the right place where I'm supposed to be. And so I think if it wasn't as the lawyer of the organization, I'd still like to be involved as an executive in a sports organization.
And there's our final whistle, and that'll do it for another episode of Talking Sports Law from K&L Gates. Special thanks to our guest, Bob Caldwell, for the great conversation about his role as Vice President and General Counsel for Real Salt Lake and Utah Royals. You can find all the episodes of our podcast on our website, klgates.com, or by searching for Hub Talks wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to be a guest on our podcast, or if you have ideas for future podcast topics, feel free to reach out to Trevor or myself. Thanks very much for listening to Talking Sports Law from K&L Gates.